Hello, everybody. My name is Joshua Samuel, and I'll be doing. Hello, everyone. My name is Joshua Samuel, and in this video, I'll be doing a film analysis of the movie called Memories of Murder. So, before we get started learning about the movie, first I want to do a little bit of a director spotlight. And our director for this film, his name is Bong Joon-ho, who's the man behind this amazing film. So, here's a couple quick facts about Bong Joon-ho. Bong Joon-ho was born in 1969 in Bongdeok-dong to a very creative family. His father and mother were poets, authors, designers. Even his grandparents were designers and taught at local universities, so he probably drew a lot of creative inspiration from them from a very young age. Following suit from them, he attended Yonsei University, not actually as a creative student, but as like a sociology major, which I thought was really interesting. And from there, he moved on to the Korean Academy of Film Arts, where obviously he learned more about his craft, which is creating films. During his time at Yonsei University, he was actually a really active protester because, like I said, he was a sociology major, so he cared very deeply about Korean society. And during this time, there was a lot of political uprising in Korea, especially at Yonsei University. So, outside of directing films, he was very active in protests around campus and around Korea. Um, he first started with a couple of short films that he just made for fun, but then he moved on to directing a couple of films, including films like The Host, Snowpiercer, and his most famous film, which is Parasite, which is the highest grossing Korean film of all time and the one that has won him the most awards, as you can see in the picture on the right. And like I showed in that picture, he's the winner of several Academy, BAFTA, which is the British Association for Film and Television, as well as Cannes awards. So he's a very decorated and respected both Korean filmmaker and director, as well as in the global community as well. So let me start talking a little bit about this film. So here's some general information about Memories of Murder. The film came out in 2003 on May 2nd, and it's actually based on a play that came out in 1996, which is titled Come See Me. It stars a number of actors, as you can see in the top left image, but the two main characters are played by Song Kang Ho and Kim Sang Kyung. Uh, if you recognize the person in the bottommost picture and the top right on the left, he's actually a very famous Korean actor as well, and he's been in plenty of films, especially ones that have been directed by Bong Joon Ho. You probably recognize him from Parasite, and he's also in a couple other big Korean films like JSA. This was Bong Joon Ho's second directorial project, which is another reason why it's so surprising why it kind of skyrocketed in its success and it was so amazing. So it's really cool to see someone who just started their second directorial project get such good praise. And like I said, it received heaps of critical praise for not only the direction, Bong's direction, but also the plot of the movie, which is very riveting. So, what is the plot of this movie? Why is it so interesting? So, here's a quick rundown of the film. The year is 1986, and we are thrust into a small town. We open the movie by seeing a field, a grain field, where a woman has been bound and has clearly been murdered. We come to learn that this woman was not the only victim of this attack. This small town is actually currently being terrorized by a serial killer who is both raping and killing women and disposing of their bodies around the outskirts of the town. This film follows the local law enforcement, played by the two actors that we see in the bottom, as well as their fellow law enforcement officers, as they race against time, as they learn patterns such as what type of color the victims usually wear, or what type of music or what type of weather is when someone becomes victimized by the serial killer. So they're racing against time, identifying the killer's pattern in order to catch him before he strikes again. They go through a number of suspects. In the top left hand side, you'll see one person who was actually a mentally challenged person who was almost coerced into saying that he was the killer when this wasn't true. Another person was also coerced, even though they were acting very suspicious. And finally, they had their final suspect, who was in the top right, a man who fit almost every aspect, but in the end, the DNA results came back inconclusive. So there's no way to know who actually was the killer. And while this frustrates the detectives to no end, they have to let him go. And it leaves us as the viewers, really uneasy because like we don't have a real resolution to who the killer is, but this injustice still occurred. Um, and that's the main plot of the film. So, how does this film tie into the historical background of Korea? More specifically, 1980s Korea, because this is when the film was set. So, during this time in Korea, there was huge political unrest. This was around the dawn of the Fifth Republic of Korea. As many of you probably know, Korea is a historically democratic nation. However, they have had their ups and downs, especially in this time period. The government had been freshly overthrown by Chun Doo-hwan, who actually staged a military coup and overthrew the democratic president, absolving himself to become, the main central person and having full control over the Korean army. So Korea became very militial at the time, and they cracked down on dissent very hard, as you can see in the image on the left. This is actually reflected in the film because one, the police officers are can be extremely violent, and no one can really fight back because of the military and by extension the police force have a lot of power. And in addition, you can actually see in the movie that the local law enforcement are not only dealing with this serial killer who's on the loose, but also with swaths of protests that erupt. And this is very accurate for the time period. Secondly, and more surprisingly to a lot of people, this film is actually based on a true case, the Hwaesong murderer. In 1990s Korea, so again, very similar to when this film was set, which makes it even more realistic, there was a man in Korea who committed 10 serial rapes and murders. And he pretty much escaped scot-free for 30 years until eventually they found him, and he confessed not only to his murders, but to some other murders, which were originally thought to be copycat murders, where another man was thrown into jail for life. So it's very real, and this was probably one of the biggest, if not the biggest, criminal case to ever happen in Korean history. So you can see how there's a clear tie between, the frustrated military who just want to get the job done to the point where they coerce people, where we see in the last slide where I talked about the military, as well as, this issue with properly catching criminals during this time, which we see with the case of the Hwaesong murderer. So what did I learn through all of this? This film was incredibly immense, so there was certainly a lot of things that I got from this film. So I had a couple of main takeaways. Firstly, that law enforcement and detective work is incredibly hard to do. Just watching this film gave me so much anxiety because even in such a small town, there were so many different variables that were going on, and I couldn't imagine being in these detectives' positions. So I have a lot greater respect for not only my local law enforcement, but people who have to deal with bigger areas or even countries as a whole, because it's very hard work and they're often under a lot of pressure from the public, victims' families, etc. Secondly, is appreciating the past while also adopting modern methods is the key to success. Throughout this film, there's a big clash between the two main detectives because one is more he's older and the other one's younger, and the older one is like very used to relying on his intuition and his ways, while the younger one is very scientific and methodical, and both of their ways on their own don't work entirely well, but when they come together and they harmonize, they're able to get as much progress as they do. So what I learned is that it's important to both appreciate the past and look forward, because that's the best way that you can accomplish what you need to do. And finally, the last 2 points are probably the most unsettling. First of all, is that anyone is capable of evil deeds. Normally, when we think of serial killers or criminals, we think of these big, disfigured, ugly, maybe like scary looking people. But what we learn at the end of the film is that a girl identifies the killer as someone who looked very ordinary. And that's why we see one of the main characters looking straight at us in the final shot of the film, which is what we see in the bottom. This to me kind of signified that all of us viewers are ordinary people, and any of us are capable of evil deeds. And the monsters live among us, which is very scary, but it's very important to know, as we should be vigilant. We shouldn't look over anyone just because we know them, because we never know what they could be capable of. And finally, life doesn't always have happy endings. This is the one that really makes you sit and think, because at the end of the movie you realize there's no absolution for the injustice that occurred, but sometimes that's just how life is, and this movie kind of gives us a microcosm of how we can experience that injustice, but also move on and grow. Here are my sources that I use for my analysis. Thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed this video as much as I enjoyed this film, and I hope you go watch it.